Welcome to Let the Quran Speak. Muslims turn to the Quran, the teachings of Prophet Muhammad, and the explanations of Muslim scholars for guidance on how to live their lives. But how can we faithfully understand and interpret the legacy of Prophet Muhammad in our modern world? This is the subject of Jonathon Brown's latest book, Misquoting Muhammad. Jonathon Brown is an associate professor of Islamic Studies and Muslim Christian Understanding in Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. Joining me to review Brown's book is Dr. Shabir Ally. Dr. Shabir, what are your impressions of Jonathon Brown's latest book?
Several points. I can talk about the things I like about it, the things that I don't exactly like about it. But let's talk about the things we like. First of all, it's a very impressive book, massive size, and it's very readable. One gets the impression that the author is well read. He's definitely a scholar. He knows the Islamic world. I mean, he has studied in various parts of the Islamic world, Yemen, Egypt, India, and so on, among Muslims in India. He is very well schooled in Islamic history. He is an expert on the subject of the hadith, or traditions which report the sayings and actions of the Prophet Muhammad, on whom be peace.
And what is the core message of his book?
I don't know if there's one particular message, but if I were to try to derive that message, it is that it is not very easy in modern times to apply the legacy of the Prophet Muhammad, both in terms of the Quranic verses and other than the Quran, traditions which have been attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. So you have sayings which were put into texts some 1400 years ago, and now modern life is very different. How do Muslims negotiate between the two, allegiance to the tradition and at the same time the level of comfort that is required within our modern landscape?
Is that a new problem, or is that something that has been a challenge throughout history?
It's been a challenge throughout history, and what Brown has done in the most excellent manner possible is that he has navigated this whole historical landscape to see how Muslims have negotiated with changes over time. What have they done when they start with a verse of the Quran and they see that it doesn't really quite fit the new and changing circumstances? What have they done with the hadith when they see that it doesn't fit the new situations? And he has shown that there's always been a variety of approaches. Some Muslims taking the hadith literally and insisting it must be so, you follow it no matter what. But mostly there have been some adjustments made by many great scholars in the past. They look at the verse and they say, well, it can't be applied exactly like that, but they do it this other way.
Are there some examples that he gives of that?
Yes. For example, the women, according to a hadith, cannot be married without their guardian's consent. But he showed that Imam Abu Hanifa, one of the great scholars and the founder of, the eponym of one of the great four schools of Islamic jurisprudence, holds that in fact if a woman is mature, she can marry without her guardian's permission, and in fact that she has more right than her guardian to decide how to deal with her own person.
So it seems that despite there being sacred texts, there's also some malleability that the scholars used in how they interpreted them.
Yes, they look at the text, they also look at the situation, they look at the reasonableness of what they're going to apply, so that in the end they arrive at something that looks good from all perspectives.
Now we're about 1400 years removed from the Prophet Muhammad, so it might seem obvious that some things nowadays are different from how they were back then. What are some of the challenges that Brown talks about in bringing that tradition to life today?
One of the problems is with verses which people interpret as being violent verses of the Quran, and so too with passages in hadith literature. Two is the question of whether women can be leaders of state, and more specifically the leader of a prayer in which there is a mixed gathering of both men and women. And there is the verse of the Quran that is interpreted to mean that a man could beat his wife. These are some of the striking examples that stand out.
And how does Brown explain those examples?
As for the woman being a head of state, he does not seem to have any difficulty with that. By combining the statements of scholars and their various approaches, Brown seems to be showing that the hadith which said that a community will not prosper if they make their head of state a woman. That hadith seems to have been explained by scholars to have something to do with the situation at the time when it was said. So it does not seem to be a universal rule. As for women leading prayers of mixed gatherings, he has shown that in fact there have been scholars over time, such as Ibn Arabi, who said that that there is no real prohibition, and there is a precedent shown in the example of Waraka, a woman who actually led her household in prayer, and the household would actually normally include men as well. So there does not seem to be any difficulty there. And as for the practical situation of how you're going to situate the men and women in prayer, he shows that in fact many schools of Islamic jurisprudence hold that if you're praying behind a leader and you're separated from the leader by, let's say, a wall, then your prayer is still valid. So to Brown, it seems possible that a woman could actually lead a mixed congregation in prayer, and the issue of haya or modesty, or the problem of being distracted in the prayer, this does not arise, because there are possible ways of dealing with these minor issues, whereas the main question is, can she lead or can she not lead? He shows that in fact in the hadith literature itself there is a precedent for a woman leading men in prayer.
Now the book has a bit of a provocative title, Misquoting Muhammad. What is Jonathon Brown trying to get at with that title?
Well, the title actually is a spin-off from a famous book by Bart Ehrman entitled Misquoting Jesus. So the similar title is used here. The approach is slightly different in that in Bart Ehrman's book, we are dealing more with a very critical approach to the sayings of Jesus. Here, Jonathon Brown is in fact following a very traditional type of approach, a Muslim traditional approach towards sifting traditions. This is something that Muslim scholars have been doing throughout the generations. Brown is schooled in that methodology, and he applies it here as well.
Can you give us a sense of what that methodology is all about?
Well, when somebody claimed that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said something, eventually scholars began to demand that they name their sources for that information. In the earliest generation, there was no need for that, because whoever said they heard the Prophet said something was there alive in the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him. But if you go 100 years later and the first generation died out and somebody is saying the Prophet said X, well, how did you know that the Prophet said X? You must have heard it from somebody else. Well, who did you hear it from? And now we want to know whether that is a reliable person. And maybe we'll go check with the person. But now 3 or 4 generations later, you can't even check with the initial people who are said to have narrated this. So what you have emerging is a chain of narrators. One person saying, I heard from A, who heard from B, who heard from C, who heard from D, who heard from E, who said that the Prophet said such and such. So now the classical Muslim scholars drew up biographies of these narrators, A, B, C, D, and E, and tried to find out who they met, who they talked to, who were their students, who were their scholars, their teachers, to see if there was a continuous link from the Prophet, peace be upon him, all the way down through the generations until this narrative comes to be written down, so that we can rely on the narrative by virtue of the known fact that these persons in the link are all reliable individuals, and we can trust what they said.
And so by this method, do we have the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad preserved accurately for us?
Well, this was not the only method. There was also a certain degree of subjectivity and use of the rational faculty that scholars apply to the process, and that if something looked like a blatant lie, they wouldn't even bother dealing with the chain of narrators because it just looks like this is not something the Prophet, peace be upon him, would have said. So as a result of all of this process, they have differentiated between the authentic and inauthentic narratives, and some books were compiled only of those narratives which are thought to be authentic, such as Al-Bukhari Sahih or Muslim's Sahih. Other books contain a mixture of the two, mainly authoritative narratives, but also some sprinkling of other ones. And sometimes it's not clear that a narrative is either strong or unreliable. It's somewhere in between. And these narratives too have been compiled in large numbers in some of the classical texts.
Now, we're coming to a close here, but you mentioned that maybe there's some criticisms that you would like to offer about the book as well. What do you have to say on that?
What I would have liked is for Brown to have given his own opinion and his own evaluation clearly in the book much more often. Most often we just have to find from the nuances in the way he says things where his opinion lies, because he's reporting the opinions of other scholars, and he's not telling us what he himself thinks about the issue. Only in the appendix, and this is where I find it more refreshing, where in the appendix he does give us his own opinion about certain hadiths. For example, the hadith that mentions that the martyr will have 72 virgins in paradise, he says that this hadith is weak. A hadith that says that a father will not be given the capital punishment if he kills his own child, he finds that hadith to be weak. And there's a hadith which says that the lowest grade of dealing with interest is like having a bout of fornication with your mother. He finds that also to be unreliable. So I like when the author tells us what precisely he thinks, so we don't have to second guess. Because we go to a book, we want to know what this author is telling us based on his expertise or her expertise, and we need to find that information easily.
Okay, thank you very much for that.
You're welcome.